Steve Harvey found DMX sleeping in his car, the night that changed two dreams. The McDonald's on Piedmont Road stood like a fluorescent island in the darkness, its golden arches casting weak amber light across an empty parking lot that stretched toward the busy intersection beyond. Inside the restaurant, the night shift workers were counting down hours until dawn, methodically wiping down red plastic tables that hadn't seen a customer in over an hour, their movements automatic after years of late-night routines. The city that never sleeps was finally taking a nap, leaving only the distant hum of interstate traffic and the occasional siren piercing the October quiet. Steve Harvey pushed through the heavy glass doors, clutching a large coffee that had gone lukewarm during his 45-minute set at the Punchline Comedy Club on Roswell Road. The coffee cup bore the McDonald's logo and felt substantial in his hands, a small comfort against the autumn chill that carried the scent of burning leaves from nearby neighborhood. His Ford Tempo sat lonely in the vast lot, one of only 3 cars still parked under the buzzing mercury vapor streetlights that created pools of harsh white illumination against the asphalt. At 39, Steve was still grinding through the comedy circuit, still chasing the dream that seemed to dance just beyond his fingertips like smoke from a cigarette. The Punchline gig had paid $300 for 2 shows, barely enough to cover gas money back to his modest apartment in East Point, and the child support payments that came due every month like clockwork. But every stage was a step closer to something bigger, every laugh from the audience a small validation that he was on the right path, even when the path seemed to stretch endlessly ahead without clear destination. Comedy was a cruel mistress. She demanded everything and promised nothing. But Steve had been seduced by her years ago and couldn't imagine doing anything else. He fumbled for his keys in the pocket of his brown leather jacket, the October air carrying not just the scent of autumn leaves but also distant barbecue smoke from some late-night gathering in one of the surrounding neighborhoods. The temperature had dropped into the 50s, unusual for Atlanta in mid-October, and Steve could see his breath forming small clouds as he exhaled. That's when he noticed the Honda Accord parked in the far corner of the lot, positioned strategically behind the large green dumpster that served the restaurant. The car's windows were completely fogged with condensation, steam rising from the exhaust pipe in ghostly wisps that indicated the engine was running. Someone was burning gas to stay warm. At first glance, Steve figured it was just another comedian or club worker taking a phone call or catching a quick nap between sets. The nightlife industry was full of people living between paychecks, sleeping in cars when rent money went to gas money, when the choice came down to shelter or transportation, and transportation usually won because you couldn't get to gigs without wheels. But something made him pause mid-step, his key halfway to the Tempo's door lock. Maybe it was the way the Honda was positioned, almost hidden behind the dumpster as if trying to become invisible to security guards or police officers who might ask uncomfortable questions. Maybe it was the recognition that came from his own 3 years of homelessness, when his Ford Tempo had been bedroom, office, sanctuary and confessional all at once. Those years from 1985 to 1988, when he'd first started comedy full-time, had taught him to spot the signs, the careful positioning for maximum privacy, the strategic idling for warmth, the way someone tried to make invisible what couldn't be hidden. Steve had learned the geography of survival during those years. He knew which Walmart parking lots allowed overnight stays, which gas stations had clean restrooms where you could wash up without attracting attention from employees, which comedy clubs had sympathetic managers who might let you sleep in your car in their lot until morning. He'd developed a sixth sense for recognizing others living the same reality, people who'd made the same impossible choice between conventional stability and artistic dreams. Walking closer, his worn Nike sneakers, silent on the oil-stained asphalt, Steve could see through the fogged rear window. There was a figure curled in the back seat, covered by what looked like a black leather jacket. Young male, African American from what he could determine through the condensation. The profile visible through the steam reminded him intensely of himself at 26, when he'd first started comedy and learned that dreams cost more than most people could afford to pay, when he discovered that talent without opportunity was just another form of heartbreak. The car was older than it had first appeared, a 1989 or 1990 Honda Accord with manual windows, manual locks, the kind of reliable but unglamorous vehicle that could be bought for under $3,000 if you knew where to look and weren't picky about cosmetic detail. The rear bumper had a small dent, and Steve could see duct tape holding down part of the vinyl top. This was transportation, not luxury. The kind of car someone drove when getting there mattered more than arriving in style. He knocked gently on the passenger window. 3 soft taps that wouldn't startle but couldn't be ignored. The figure inside jerked awake instantly. The kind of startled movement that comes from sleeping with one eye open, always alert for potential danger. In the streets, deep sleep was a luxury that could get you robbed or arrested. The young man scrambled upright, his hand moving instinctively to his waistband before his eyes focused and he recognized he was being approached by a middle-aged comedian holding McDonald's coffee. The defensive posture relaxed slightly, but wariness remained in his movements as he cranked down the window manually. The car was definitely older with manual everything. "You all right, brother?" Steve asked, keeping his voice low and non-threatening. He'd learned during his own homeless years that approaching someone in vulnerable circumstances required delicacy. Too aggressive and they'd flee. Too condescending and they'd shut down completely. The key was to project genuine concern without pity, strength without dominance. He could see the young man's eyes now, and they told a story. Alert and intelligent but rimmed with exhaustion, defensive but not hostile. There was pride there, fighting with desperation, and something else, a spark of ambition that hadn't been extinguished despite whatever circumstances had led to sleeping in a car behind a McDonald's dumpster. Steve recognized that look. He'd seen it in his own mirror during the worst time. "I'm good," came the reply, though everything about the situation suggested otherwise. The young man had a distinctive rasp to his voice, like he'd been shouting or smoking too much, or perhaps just like he'd been sleeping in cramped quarters without proper rest. "Just taking a break." Steve nodded, understanding the code perfectly. "Just taking a break" was what you said when someone discovered you living in your car. "Just resting my eyes" was the response to being caught sleeping in a parking lot. "Just waiting for a friend" explained why you'd been sitting in the same spot for hours. All phrases Steve had used himself when someone had discovered him living in his Ford Tempo outside comedy clubs from Detroit to Miami, showering in gas station bathrooms and washing his clothes in sinks when the laundromats were closed. "Mind if I ask your name?" Steve continued, settling into a more relaxed posture to show he wasn't in a hurry to leave. "Earl." The response came after a hesitation, as if the young man was calculating whether honesty or deception would serve him better in this moment. "Earl Simmons." "Steve Harvey." He extended his hand through the window and Earl shook it with a grip that was firm despite the obvious fatigue. The handshake was important. It established equality, humanity, respect. It said, "I see you as a person, not a problem. I'm a comedian. Just finished a set inside at the Punchline Club up on Roswell. You from around here?" Earl glanced toward the McDonald's, then back to Steve, studying the older man's face for signs of judgment or condescension. Something in Steve's demeanor, perhaps the lack of judgment, or the way he'd introduced himself as if they were meeting at a business conference rather than a parking lot intervention, seemed to put Earl at ease. "Yonkers," Earl said finally. "New York. I came down here to handle some business." Steve had been in entertainment long enough to know what business usually meant for young African-American men traveling south with nothing but the clothes on their backs and demo tapes on their dashboard. Music business. The kind of business that required more hope than sense, more persistence than preparation, more faith than financial backing. The entertainment industry was littered with the dreams of young men who'd believed talent would be enough, who'd learned too late that the music business was indeed a business. Emphasis on the second word. "Music?" Steve asked, though it wasn't really a question. Earl nodded slowly, as if admitting to a crime he wasn't sure he'd committed yet. "Rap. Hip-hop. I got these demo tapes." He gestured vaguely toward the front seat, where Steve could now see a stack of cassette tapes scattered across the dashboard like fallen dominoes. Each tape was labeled in careful handwriting, the kind of meticulous preparation that suggested serious artistic ambition rather than casual dabbling. This was familiar territory for Steve. Over his 15 years grinding through comedy clubs, he'd met hundreds of aspiring entertainers. Most were delusional, convinced that wanting something badly enough would make it happen. Some were talented but lazy, expecting opportunity to find them while they waited passively. A few had talent and work ethic but no luck or connections, destined to be amazing artists that nobody would ever hear. Very rarely, maybe once every few years, he encountered someone who had all 3 elements: talent, drive, and that indefinable quality that separated entertainers from stars. "How long you been sleeping in your car?" Steve asked directly, cutting through the polite small talk to the reality of the situation. Earl's jaw tightened visibly, pride and shame wrestling across his features like opposing armies fighting for control of his expression. His hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles showing white against dark skin. "It's not like that, brother." Steve's voice carried the weight of experience, the authority of someone who'd lived this reality and survived to tell about it. "I slept in my car for 3 years. Ford Tempo. Back when I was starting out in comedy, parked outside clubs from Detroit to Miami, showering in gas station bathrooms and washing my clothes in sinks when the laundromats were closed. I know what it looks like. And I know what it costs. Not just money, but pride, dignity. So I'll ask again. How long?" The directness, combined with the revelation that Steve had lived this exact reality, seemed to crack something in Earl's defensive posture. The recognition that he was talking to someone who understood, who wouldn't judge because he'd been there himself, created space for honesty. 6 weeks, Earl admitted, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "Maybe 7, I lost count after the first month. I came down from New York with $300 and a tank of gas, thought I'd find somebody to listen to my music, get signed, drive home rich and famous." He laughed, but there was no humor in it, only bitter recognition of his own naivety. "Turns out the music business ain't like the movies. Turns out nobody wants to hear your demo tapes, unless you already got a deal, and you can't get a deal unless somebody already heard your demo tapes." Steve chuckled, a sound of recognition rather than mockery. "Nothing ever is like the movie. The movies don't show the parts where you eat peanut butter sandwiches for dinner 3 nights in a row because that's all you can afford. They don't show the parts where you consider giving up and going home every single day. You eaten today? Had a $1 menu burger this afternoon." Earl's honesty was coming easier now, the relief of talking to someone who understood outweighing his pride. "What time this afternoon?" Earl's silence was answer enough. Steve could read the calculation in the young man's face. How to stretch one burger across 12 hours. How to make a small Coke last all evening. How to convince your stomach to stop growling when there was no money for more food. Steve made a decision that would ripple through both their lives for decades to come. It wasn't a calculated decision or a business decision. It was a human decision, made by someone who remembered being hungry and alone, and convinced that his dreams were foolish luxuries he couldn't afford. "Get your tapes," Steve said. "Follow me back inside. We're gonna get you a proper meal and you're gonna tell me about this music of yours. And don't worry about money. I got this." 25 minutes later, they sat across from each other in a corner booth. The same booth where Steve often came after late-night shows to decompress and think through new material. Earl was demolishing a Big Mac meal with the intensity of someone who hadn't eaten properly in days, while Steve nursed his coffee and listened. Between bites, Earl talked about growing up in the school street projects in Yonkers, about navigating the crack epidemic that had devastated his neighborhood in the 80s, about his mother Arnett's struggle with addiction that had left him essentially raising himself. He talked about the group home where he'd been placed at age 10, where he'd learned to channel rage into rhymes as a survival mechanism. He talked about Reddy Ron, the older rapper who'd taken him under his wing before betraying that trust by introducing him to crack cocaine when he was just 14 years old. He talked about Rough Riders, the collective of friends from his neighborhood, who believed in his talent even when he didn't believe in himself, who'd pooled their resources to help him make this trip to Atlanta. "I ain't like these other rappers," Earl said, pausing between French fries to make eye contact with Steve. "I ain't trying to talk about champagne and designer clothes and things I don't know nothing about. I don't know nothing about that lifestyle. I talk about what I know: pain, struggle, faith, the streets, but also what comes after the streets. What comes after the pain. Because there has to be something after. You know, there has to be redemption somewhere." Steve nodded, understanding completely. His comedy had always been rooted in truth, in the experiences of working-class black life that mainstream entertainment often ignored or caricatured. The best comedy, like the best art of any kind, came from authenticity, from mining your own experience for universal truths that could connect with other people's experiences. "Let me hear something," Steve said. Earl hesitated, looking around the nearly empty McDonald's. "Here now." "Keep it low, But yeah, if you're gonna sleep in parking lots for your art, I need to know if your art is worth sleeping in parking lots for. Earl pulled out a cassette tape, one that looked worn from constant handling and careful storage. He'd written Rough Riders' anthem, Demo, on the label in careful block letters, the handwriting of someone who took pride in presentation even when resources were limited. Steve had a portable cassette player in his car, essential equipment for any entertainer who wanted to review sets or rehearse material during long drives between gigs. They went back outside into the crisp October air, Earl following Steve to the Ford Temple. Steve popped the tape into his player and handed Earl one of the foam earbuds that came with the cheap headphones he'd bought at a gas station. What he heard over the next 4 minutes and 37 seconds changed everything he thought he knew about hip-hop music. The voice that came through the speakers was unlike anything Steve had encountered in the genre. It wasn't smooth and commercially polished like LL Cool J, or politically conscious and intellectually dense like Public Enemy, or playfully clever and jazz-influenced like A Tribe Called Quest. This was something entirely different. Something primal and raw that seemed to claw its way up from the deepest places of human experience. The lyrics were simultaneously violent and spiritual, aggressive and vulnerable, street-smart and philosophically complex. Earl rapped about crack addiction and prayer, about violence and redemption, about loyalty and betrayal, often within the same verse. But it was more than the words themselves. It was the delivery, the way Earl's voice moved from a whisper to a growl to something approaching a bark, the way he used silence and space as effectively as words, the way he made every syllable feel like it mattered. Steve recognized something in Earl's voice that he'd only heard in the greatest entertainers he'd worked with over the years. Authenticity so complete it became magnetic. This wasn't someone pretending to be tough or sensitive or spiritual for commercial appeal. This was someone allowing every aspect of himself to exist simultaneously, contradictions and all, refusing to sanitize his reality for public consumption. When the song ended, Steve sat in silence for a moment, processing what he'd just heard. Earl watched him nervously, drumming his fingers against his knee, trying to read Steve's expression in the dim light cast by the tempo's dome light. "That you?" Steve asked finally. "That's me. That's really you? That's not some character you created. That's as real as it gets. That's my life on that tape." Steve ejected the cassette and handed it back to Earl with the reverence of someone returning a sacred text. "You're right, you're not like other rappers. You're something else entirely. You're something the world needs to hear." Earl's face lit up with the kind of hope that can be dangerous for someone with nothing left to lose. The kind of hope that can sustain you through months of rejection or destroy you if it proves to be unfounded. "You really think it's good?" "I think it's better than good. I think it's necessary." Steve leaned back against his car seat, studying Earl's face in the dim light. "But talent don't mean nothing if nobody hears it, and nobody's gonna hear it if you starve to death in this parking lot or give up and go home because you ran out of gas money." That's when Steve made his second major decision of the night, one that would prove to be as life-changing as the first. "You got anywhere to be tomorrow?" "Tomorrow?" Earl laughed, but this time there was some actual humor in it, tinged with irony. "Man, I got nowhere to be until somebody signs me or I run out of gas money and have to drive back to New York with my tail between my legs, telling everybody I failed. Then you're gonna come with me. I got some people I want you to meet, and we're gonna figure out how to get your music heard by the right people." Over the next 3 months, Steve Harvey became Earl Simmons' unofficial manager, mentor and big brother rolled into one. It started small, Steve letting Earl shower at his apartment, giving him a place to do laundry, providing regular meals and a safe place to sleep when the nights got too cold for car camping. But it grew into something much more significant as Steve recognized that Earl's talent deserved a real chance, not just kindness. Steve began introducing Earl to the network of relationships he'd built over his years in entertainment. He took him to radio stations where DJs would take meetings because Steve Harvey asked for them. He connected him with producers who would listen to demo tapes because Steve vouched for the artist behind them. He opened doors that had been invisible to a young man sleeping in his car, doors that only became visible when someone with established industry relationships pointed them out and provided introduction. But more than connections, Steve provided something Earl had never experienced in his 26 years of life: Belief from someone who had nothing to gain from offering it. Steve wasn't positioning himself for a percentage of Earl's future earnings or trying to become his manager for financial gain. He was simply convinced that Earl's voice deserved to be heard, and he was willing to use his own credibility and reputation to make that happen. The process wasn't smooth or quick. The music industry in 1996 was still largely segregated, with rap music considered a niche market that major labels approached cautiously. Earl's style was particularly challenging for executives to categorize: too hardcore for mainstream radio, too spiritual for gangsta rap, too complex for simple commercial formula. Many of the people Steve introduced him to were impressed by his talent, but uncertain about his commercial viability. The breakthrough came in late January. Steve had arranged for Earl to meet with Ron Lawrence, a veteran DJ at Hot 97. Lawrence listened to 3 songs, asked Earl to freestyle over a beat to prove the recorded talent was real, then made a call to Irv Gotti at Def Jam Records while Earl was still sitting in the studio. "There's this kid," Lawrence told Gotti over the phone, with Earl listening to every word. "Steve Harvey brought him by. Says he's got something special. And Steve don't put his name behind just anybody. Steve Harvey the comedian. Why's a comedian scouting rappers? Don't know, don't care. But if Steve Harvey's willing to put his reputation behind somebody, that somebody's worth hearing. This kid's got something different. Something real." The phone call led to a meeting the following week. The meeting led to a showcase at Def Jam's Atlanta offices. The showcase led to other showcases, which led to negotiations, which led to a contract. By April 1997, Earl Simmons had officially become DMX, and Steve Harvey's 3 months of mentorship and advocacy had set in motion the career of one of hip-hop's most distinctive and influential voices. But the story was far from over, as DMX's fame exploded over the following months. First with the underground success of Get At Me Dog, then with the mainstream breakthrough of Rough Riders Anthem, and finally with the unprecedented commercial success of releasing 2 #1 albums in the same calendar year. Earl never forgot the comedian who'd found him sleeping in a McDonald's parking lot. In December 1998, at the absolute peak of his fame, DMX tracked down Steve Harvey. He found him performing at the Atlanta Comedy Club, the same venue where Steve had been working 2 years earlier. DMX was now a certified superstar, his face on magazine covers from Rolling Stone to Time, his music dominating radio stations and MTV programs. His first album had gone quadruple platinum. His second had debuted at #1, and he was being hailed as hip-hop's newest superstar. Meanwhile, Steve was still grinding through the comedy circuit, still driving the same Ford Tempo, still staying in budget hotels, still believing his big break was just one good set away. His career had progressed modestly. He was getting better gigs and making more money, but he was still far from the television success he dreamed about. DMX walked into the club after Steve's midnight show, unannounced and unexpected. The crowd recognized him immediately. By then everyone knew the dark, intense rapper who barked like a dog and prayed like a preacher, who'd brought a new level of raw spirituality to hip-hop. But DMX ignored the attention and the requests for autographs, walking straight to Steve's table where the comedian was counting his night's earnings and planning his drive to the next city. "You probably don't remember me." DMX started, standing beside Steve's table. Steve looked up and studied the face before him. The young man from the parking lot had filled out considerably, gained muscle and confidence and the bearing of someone who'd achieved everything he dreamed about. His clothes were expensive now, designer jeans and jewelry that caught the club's stage lights, but the eyes were the same, still intelligent and alert, though now carrying confidence instead of desperation. "Earl Simmons," Steve said slowly, recognition dawning. "From Yonkers, October 15, 1996. DMX smiled, the first time Steve had ever seen him do so without reservation or guardedness. "That's right. McDonald's on Piedmont Road. You bought me a Big Mac and changed my life." They talked until the club closed at 2 in the morning, then moved the conversation to DMX's new Bentley Continental, sitting in the same parking lot where they'd first met. The contrast was surreal, discussing their lives in a luxury vehicle worth more than most people's annual salaries, parked in the spot where Earl had once slept in a beat-up Honda Accord. DMX told Steve about everything that had happened since their last meeting: the record deal, the tours, the movie opportunities,
the respect he'd earned from his hip-hop peers. But mostly he talked about how Steve's belief had given him the confidence to believe in himself. How those 3 months of mentorship had provided not just practical help, but psychological foundation. "You know what you really did for me?" DMX asked as they sat looking at the McDonald's, now closed for the night with its interior lights dimmed. It wasn't just the introductions or the connections, though those were important. It was seeing me when I felt invisible. It was treating me like I mattered when I felt like I did. That's what saved me. Not the music business connections, but the human connection. That one night you saved my life. Steve was quiet for a moment, genuinely moved by the revelation. He'd had no idea that his small act of kindness had led to this level of success for the young man. In his mind, he'd simply done what anyone with a conscience should do when they encounter someone struggling. "You saved yourself, Earl. I just pointed you in the right direction." "Nah," DMX said firmly, his voice taking on the intensity that had made him famous. "Without that night, I would have driven back to New York broke and broken within another week or two. Would have given up on music entirely. Probably ended up dead or in prison like most of the guys I grew up with. You didn't just change my career trajectory. You literally saved my life." DMX reached into his leather jacket and pulled out a manila envelope that had been folded carefully to fit in his inside pocket. "I've been carrying this around for months. Looking for you. Had to hire a private investigator to track you down." Inside the envelope was a cashier's check for $50,000, made out to Steve Harvey. Steve stared at the amount printed in careful bank numerals. More money than he'd made in the past 2 years combined. His hands actually trembled slightly as he held the check, feeling its weight and significance. "Earl, I can't take this. I didn't help you for money. It's not charity and it's not a gift," DMX said, his tone becoming businesslike. "It's payment for services rendered. You worked as my manager for 3 months. You promoted me, you opened doors for me. You managed my career when I couldn't manage it myself. Any professional manager would have taken 20% of my earning. $50,000 is less than 5% of what I made this year. And I only made it because you believed in me when nobody else would. I didn't do it for money," Steve protested. "I know, that's exactly why you deserve it. That's exactly why you're the only person who should get it." Steve held the check, feeling its potential to transform his life. $50,000 would change everything for him. It would buy time to work on his craft instead of just surviving day to day. It would provide the financial stability to be selective about gigs, instead of taking anything that paid rent. It would fund the development of the television career he'd been imagining, but couldn't afford to pursue properly. "There's something else," DMX continued, pulling out a business card from his wallet. "I got a call last week from somebody at the WB network. They're developing a new variety show. Something family-friendly that can compete with the other networks in prime time. They asked me if I knew any comedians who understood both struggle and success. Somebody authentic who could connect with working-class audiences."
Steve looked up from the check, sensing where this was heading. "I gave them your name," DMX said. "I told them you're the realest person I know in entertainment. Someone who's never forgotten where he came from. You got a meeting with them next Tuesday if you want it. They're specifically looking for someone with your background and perspective." Steve stared at the business card. "Janet Williams, Director of Development, the WB Network. A phone number and address in Los Angeles. They've already seen some of your material," DMX continued. "I sent them tapes of your comedy sets. They're interested. Very interested." The meeting led to the Steve Harvey Show, a sitcom that ran for 6 successful seasons from 1996 to 2002 and launched Steve's television career into the stratosphere. That show led to Family Feud, which led to radio success with the Steve Harvey Morning Show, which led to best-selling books and motivational speaking engagements, and a multimedia empire that would eventually be worth hundreds of millions of dollars. But Steve never forgot the night in McDonald's parking lot that had started it all. Years later, during interviews about his rise to fame, Steve Harvey would often tell the story of helping a young rapper who was sleeping in his car. He'd talk about how kindness was an investment that always paid dividends, how treating people with dignity cost nothing but could change everything. He'd use the story as an example of how success should be shared, how those who achieve their dreams have an obligation to help others achieve theirs. But he wouldn't tell the complete story about the check, about the WB network connection, about how DMX had literally launched his television career until DMX's funeral in April. Standing at the podium in the Barclays Center in Brooklyn, looking out at 15,000 mourners, including everyone from hip-hop legends to street kids from Yonkers, Steve finally revealed the full truth about their relationship. People always ask me about that night I found Earl Simmons sleeping in his car, Steve said, his voice cracking slightly as he spoke into the microphone. They treat it like I did something heroic, like I was some kind of good Samaritan who saved the day. But the truth is, the hero in that story wasn't me, it was Earl. Because what Earl did for me after he became successful, the opportunities he created, the doors he opened, the belief he showed in me, that's what real heroes do. Steve paused, looking at the red casket that bore DMX's body, the word faith spelled out in large golden letters across its surface. 25 years ago, I thought I was saving him. Turns out he was saving me. That's the kind of man Earl was. Even when he was broken, he was still trying to fix other people. Even when he was struggling, he was still lifting others up. He taught me that success isn't about what you get. It's about what you give back. It's about remembering where you came from and reaching back to pull others up behind you.